Today I'm going to show you how to service your carburetor on older jet skis. If you have a personal watercraft that's an older Yamaha or Sea-Doo, anytime from the late 80s through the mid to late 90s, this video will help you clean and or rebuild your carburetor. Alright, we're going to start here with a Yamaha Wave Runner Mikuni single carburetor. But the Yamaha and the Sea-Doo use the same model carburetors for the most part, and all the Mikunis are almost identical. Many of your personal watercraft will also have two carburetors instead of one, and you'll have to do the same procedure to both of them. You can see the choke mechanism. We're checking that to make sure it operates freely. We've removed the fuel lines from it, but we still have the fuel pump pulse line in place. Then you see the input and output for the fuel lines there. Now we're going to show you just an overview of the carburetor. You can see the adjustment screw and the fuel inlet and outlet ports. We're just generally inspecting a carburetor to make sure everything looks good and there's no signs of visible physical damage to it. Everything moves and opens as it should before we get down to actually opening it up. And on these newer carburetors, the newer models don't have as many adjustments as the older ones do. A lot of them have a high set speed screw and a low set speed screw and an idle screw, and some of the newer ones only have one or two screws. But the first thing we're going to start by removing the cover plate over the diaphragms. So we've set the carburetor down, the diaphragm plate has been removed with the 4 screws, and we're going to inspect the actual diaphragms there. This is the diaphragm that meters the fuel flow into the carburetor from the pump. You need to check it and make sure it's nice and soft and supple. Any signs of cracking, hardening, or damage, and it's going to need to be replaced. Now we're going to look at the physical part of the fuel intake system here. We got to clean the groove out where the gasket sets on. We're going to inspect the metering level and the spring and make sure the metering arm is set at the proper height. And while we have it apart, we're going to give it a clean. Alright, we're using a Phillips screwdriver to remove the set screw for the metering arm, and you have to be careful when taking this apart because there's a spring underneath the arm, and if you pull it apart too fast, the spring could go flying off and you'd lose it. But if you have a rebuild kit, it comes with a new spring, so it's not going to be that bad of a deal. But you can see the spring starting to come up as I loosen the screw. Alright, once we have that disassembled, we're going to disassemble the fuel pump side of the carburetor. This is a pulse vacuum operated fuel pump that has one line coming from the fuel tank, another going to the fuel tank, and a third that goes down to the crankcase on the engine that provides the pulse vacuum to move the diaphragm up and down to actually pump the fuel through a one-way valve. And here's the diaphragm right here with my finger. Again, we're checking to see if it's nice and supple, no signs of damage or cracking, no brittleness. We're going to remove the base plate to the fuel pump. This is also known as the one-way check valve. We're going to inspect the gaskets and diaphragms and seals underneath it. And while we have it apart, we'll blow some carburetor cleaner through all the holes. Again, the diaphragms, seals, gaskets are all intact, nice and supple. If they were brittle or cracked or decayed or overly dirty, we would replace them all. This carburetor turned out to be really clean and required very little work other than some cleaning around where you can see this dirt here on the surface. Now let me show you how the metering arm works. There's this metal tab on the bottom side of the main diaphragm, and as the vacuum pressure in the engine and carburetor changes, the metal tab pushes down on the arm right there, allowing more fuel to come into the carburetor, into the engine. And when you're sitting here in a non-running position, the top of the arm should be level with the base plate there in the carburetor. So now we're going to put the diaphragm back on with the little pin pointing downward. And we're going to reseal it with the cover plate on top and secure all 4 screws tightly. There's a notch cut out in this, so it only fits on one way. And of course, while we had it apart, we used that opportunity to spray carburetor cleaner through all of the little ports and orifices and holes and nooks and crannies to make sure there's no dirt or debris still inside. One of the biggest problems on these is the fuel that people use, that's provided for us to use nowadays. Most of it has at least 10% ethanol in it, and the ethanol is very hard on the black rubber fuel lines that we have on these carburetors, causing decay in the fuel lines and small pieces to break off and become lodged in different ports and things, like underneath these idle screws or mixture screws, and little pieces of debris in there clogging it up will restrict your power, make the jet ski hard to start. And if you're still running the stock fuel lines that are the black rubber lines, you need to empty the fuel out at the end of every season. And anytime you're not going to be riding it for more than a few weeks, run it till it's totally out of fuel. That way you won't have all the fuel sitting in the lines, causing more chances for decay. Alright, just to reiterate and make sure we're clear, if you're suffering from hard starting issues or performance issues, the fuel system's a good place to start. Disassemble your carburetor, clean it thoroughly, and replace the interior parts with a rebuild kit if there's any sign of brittleness or decay.